Hi, I'm Bill Newcott, film critic for the Saturday Evening Post and creator of AARP's Movies for Grown-Ups. And I've been reviewing movies on TV, radio, in print, and online since they sold bonbons at the movie theaters. I'm really proud of the 5 Gatsbys, this presentation I did marking the centennial of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby for the Mystery Writers of America. And I'd sure love to bring it to your literary and or movie-loving group as well. You wouldn't even have to dress up for the occasion, although the mystery writers sure seem to enjoy that. If you like this presentation, may I direct you to the many other movie-related programs I have ready to go for you, exploring the history, the social influence, the geography, and simply the pure, unapologetic, sometimes geeky love of film in all its moods and genres. And as I did for the mystery writers, I'd be more than happy to customize a subject just for you. There's nothing I enjoy more than talking about the movies, so yes, let's talk, and enjoy the 5 Gatsbys. The literary world was beside itself in 1925, anxiously awaiting the publication of F. Scott Fitzgerald's latest novel, The Great Gatsby. He'd already created a sensation with his 2 earlier books, This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and Damned, and there was every reason to believe that Fitzgerald, the great chronicler of the Roaring Twenties, would once more hit literary pay dirt. Well, it's no overstatement to say that, for the 1925 readers anyway, The Great Gatsby was not just a bomb, it was the 1920s equivalent of a nuclear disaster. Just 25,000 copies of Fitzgerald's slim novel were sold from the first printing, and if you happen to have one of those, do hold on to it. But like all great art, The Great Gatsby had a certain amount of stickiness to it. The story and its sly observations about life in 1920s America burrowed into the nation's psyche. And now, 100 years later, The Great Gatsby is generally recognized as the great American novel. I have, in preparation for this presentation, sat down and watched nearly every screen version of The Great Gatsby there is, and I guess the main lesson I walked away with is that, in the end, movies based on books are their own kind of literary criticism, each one recasting the original work in the light of the world at the time when that film was made. Sales were so disappointing originally, in fact, that there was some surprise that a New York theater producer thought enough of it to mount a live stage production based on the book. The 1926 Broadway play The Great Gatsby opened at the Ambassador Theater, still there in fact, and ran for 112 performances. A healthy run in those days. It was directed by a young fellow named George Cukor, who would go on to become one of the 20th century's top film directors over at MGM. So successful was the show that, in fact, in 1927, Paramount adapted the novel for the screen. The first film version of The Great Gatsby starred Warner Baxter, who 2 years later would win the second ever Best Actor Oscar for playing the Cisco Kid, so he had quite a range of stuff going for him there. Lois Wilson, who at age 33 had already starred in nearly 100 movies, played Daisy. Unfortunately, the film seems to be lost forever. It was made on nitrate stock, which, like 80% of films made before 1950, disintegrated in the can. There remains, however, a 1-minute trailer with a glimpse of scenes from the story. One here seems to show the gas station owner, Mr. Wilson, holding the gun with which he will eventually kill Gatsby. And I'm about to tell you, may as well right now, there's going to be spoilers here tonight, so if you haven't read the book, you may want to leave the room, or consider this your Cliff Notes, I suppose. Next, we get a look at Nick Carraway, finding Wilson dead of a gunshot wound, and presumably he's about to find Gatsby floating in a pool. Here are Gatsby and Daisy getting reacquainted in a sexy scene. And a couple of scenes from Gatsby's lavish Long Island parties, including gangs of women for some reason running up and down the floating staircase, and also, for some reason, synchronized swimming. And here's the celebrated Plaza Hotel scene with Tom confronting Gatsby with what he's learned about him. So you see, there's absolutely nothing new at the movies. 100 years later, or 100 years earlier, they were still giving away the whole movie in the coming attractions. I couldn't find any box office returns for this Great Gatsby's 1927 screen incarnation, but the reviews were almost universally negative. Critics complained that Baxter was too stiff to play the boyish, insecure Gatsby. My favorite review of the film was Motion Picture Magazine that said, quote, "The director has seized upon every opportunity the book gave for staging an orgy. So now we know what orgies looked like in 1925. I guess the ultimate review came from Fitzgerald himself, who left halfway through the film with his wife Zelda, and Zelda later commented, "It's rotten and awful and terrible, and we left." I suspect some of the problem readers and moviegoers had with digesting The Great Gatsby in the Roaring Twenties was the fact that readers and viewers were still living in the Roaring Twenties. Fitzgerald was a writer, and he had a perspective they just couldn't understand. So it wasn't until some 20 years later, after critics and readers alike began reassessing The Great Gatsby. Incidentally, how that happened was during World War II, because the book was so thin and light and easy to ship, millions of copies were sent out to soldiers overseas as something to entertain them. And they came back telling their friends and family how much they loved this little book they'd read, and sales sparked and never stopped after that. Anyway, critics and readers began reassessing not just The Great Gatsby, but what the Roaring Twenties were all about. And so Paramount took another stab at making a movie of the book. Today, nearly no one has ever seen the 1949 version of The Great Gatsby. It has been pulled by Paramount probably around 1973 or 74 when they were about to release the Robert Redford version, and so they wanted only that one to be in circulation. It wasn't a hit, despite starring one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the title role, Alan Ladd. But it's a fascinating project, and particularly in the many ways it bears little resemblance to the original. Alan Ladd had wanted for years to play Gatsby. He was born in Oklahoma. He saw a parallel between his success story and that of the character in Fitzgerald's novel. Also, I suppose he had those actors' insecurities that sort of meshed a bit with the things Gatsby was going through. Paramount still owned the rights to the books, and for years, the studio teased Ladd into making other movies, with the promise that if you make this one, maybe we'll get around to making that Gatsby film. And they did that to him for years. And when they finally decided to do it, they decided to make it, oddly enough, a B picture from the start. It's one of those movies that would be shown at the bottom half of a double bill. And if there's any doubt they intended it to be a B picture, that is dashed by the fact that they assigned the film director John Farrow to do it. He was known as King of the B's. He prided himself on making movies that made money, whether they were really good or not. He was a stylish director, but a very, very economical one. There would be nearly no location shooting. The whole thing, even scenes on Gatsby's boat, would be filmed inside a studio soundstage. But even on a shoestring budget, and as a B picture, the studio knew a Gatsby film would draw audiences. Solely with its fabulous evocation of the Roaring Twenties. There was booze, there was crime, there was greed, there was sex. And there was the motion picture production code, the industry censor who was ready to redline just about everything that was fun and frolicsome in the script. And the script was already a curious thing, in some ways barely resembling the original book. You see, the 1949 movie version of Gatsby was, interestingly enough, based not directly on the novel, but on the script of the 1926 New York stage production, written by Owen Davis, who had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1923 for his play Icebound. In adapting the book to the stage, Davis turned up the volume on everything considerably, and he streamlined some of Fitzgerald's narrative detours. You'll remember that in most tellings of the story, for instance, Gatsby's true profession is teased, but left largely to speculation. In the 1949 movie, Alan Ladd's Gatsby is a straight-up gangster. In the first 10 minutes, he kills 2 guys. And at one point in one of his parties, he sucker punches a guy who talks to him the wrong way. He's a tough guy. Gatsby's henchmen are a bunch of old war buddies who followed him from World War I heroism to a life in crime, even though they know the eyes of God are watching them, and those glasses that you see in the background there are one of the thematic motifs that span every single screen version of The Great Gatsby. This is the only version of Gatsby that does not begin with Fitzgerald's famous first line, that one where Nick recalls some sage advice he got from his father, nor does it end with his immortal closer about humanity beating its oars ceaselessly into the past. Instead, at the insistence of a Hollywood censor, the film begins years after Gatsby's death, with Nick visiting Gatsby's grave. Standing by a modest headstone, Nick solemnly recites the scripture referenced on the grave, Proverbs 4:12, and he says it as if from the pulpit at Westminster Cathedral, "There is a way in which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death." In other words, the censor is scolding us, don't be fooled by all the fun these people are having. They're all in hell now. From start to finish, the 1949 Gatsby plays like a classic film noir. Ladd may have yearned to play Gatsby, but he seems strangely ill-suited for the role. His Gatsby is way too much in control of his obsession with Daisy, too confident in pulling off his crackpot scheme to win her over. Plus, Ladd himself made some odd demands during filming that undermined his performance. For one thing, he refused to kiss his co-star, Betty Field, because he thought it would be a bad example to his young fans if a character he played kissed a married woman who was not his wife. The killing apparently was okay, and Ladd would not remove his wedding ring. And it shows up prominently several times in the film, and that causes the audience maybe to wonder if Gatsby has another secret he's not telling them about. Really, of all the couples in the 1949 Gatsby, perhaps the most memorable are George and Myrtle Wilson, played by two actors who were new to audiences then, but who would go on to make their mark in the decades to come. George was played by an impossibly young Howard Da Silva, stage and screen star known to most of us as Ben Franklin in the film 1776. Da Silva's George, certain his wife is cheating on him, is a heartbreakingly complex guy. He's a man who's clearly a former man of strength and pride, and now those qualities are fading behind a smoldering curtain of sickness and humiliation. Myrtle is a brash, brassy Shelley Winters, and although this version gives Myrtle less to do than any other, she's maybe got 10 lines in the whole film. She's pretty much a sexy, screaming cipher. Winters' sheer screen power makes her unforgettable. It's funny, but in some ways, the 1949 Gatsby version may actually work better as a conventional movie than the other entries. Those versions treat Fitzgerald's prose almost like scripture, offering long passages recited by Nick or other characters with deferential solemnity. Here, everyone is always moving. There's a fist fight every few minutes, there's gunplay, and a lot less lingering on the spectacle of Gatsby's parties. The film was made years after Fitzgerald's death, so it's hard to imagine whether or not he would have liked it. But it's hard to believe he did not have some input into the 1926 play in which the film is based. We know he was in New York, the play was produced in New York, and we do know that while he openly hated the 1927 film, he's not on record as objecting to the stage play. A side note here, and a reason I always find the George and Myrtle Wilson narrative just a little distracting, I just wonder if cartoonist Hank Ketchum was aware that he was appropriating George Wilson's name for the grumpy next-door neighbor of Dennis the Menace. Now, it's apropos of nothing, has nothing to do with the film. It's just one of those things I think about. Like certain kinds of locusts, screen adaptations of The Great Gatsby seem to return every 20 years or so. In the early 1970s, producer Robert Evans' wife, actress Ali MacGraw, who she'd just broken through in Love Story, decided she wanted to play Daisy. Evans, the good husband, paid F. Scott Fitzgerald's daughter $350,000 for the screen rights to Gatsby, and then he paid $300,000 to none other than Truman Capote to write the screenplay. But when Capote delivered the script, Evans was distressed to see that Capote had basically opened the pages of The Great Gatsby and started retyping the book word for word. When a character wasn't speaking Fitzgerald's dialogue, Capote simply inserted Fitzgerald's descriptions of the actions as stage directions. Evans complained, and as Capote put it, and I will not try to reproduce that voice, he said, "Well, how am I supposed to improve upon F. Scott Fitzgerald?" That wasn't good enough for Evans, and he had a plan B already in place. He immediately turned to Francis Ford Coppola, who was in the process of editing the film that would make him a legend, The Godfather. At that point, though, no one knew if The Godfather would be a hit. It was running way over budget. There were stories about trouble on the set and the troubles with the star, Marlon Brando. Coppola decided he'd better take this little side gig while he still had a decent reputation in Hollywood. Coppola's script is perhaps the most lyrical of all the Gatsby screen adaptations. He sees the plot as, first and foremost, a story of unrequited love. He downplays Fitzgerald's themes of social class and mindless prosperity. There's barely a line of dialogue that is not lifted directly from the book itself, with some notable exceptions. You see, in reading The Great Gatsby, Coppola was somewhat shocked to discover that there was next to no dialogue between the two lovers, Gatsby and Daisy. Instead, the pair's interactions are filtered through the accounts of Gatsby and Daisy and other characters and told directly to Nick Carraway. But Coppola, who desperately wanted to remain true to Fitzgerald's vision, came up with an ingenious solution. He lifted snippets of dialogue from Fitzgerald's other novels, which similarly dealt with troubled relationships between men and women. So the Fitzgerald devotee who's watching Robert Evans' Gatsby will recognize moments shared between Dick and Nicole Diver in Tender is the Night, and Anthony Patch and Gloria Gilbert in The Beautiful and Damned. Now, Daisy, of course, was the easy part. She was cast from the start, with Robert Evans' wife, Ali MacGraw, set to star. Evans wanted Warren Beatty, but he said no, he didn't want to work with Ali MacGraw. Jack Nicholson turned it down because he didn't want to work with Ali MacGraw either, and I have no idea why not. She's a perfectly fine actress. Evans almost hired Marlon Brando, who was already 49 years old and way too old, but he settled on Robert Redford. And to say he settled on Robert Redford, I guess is saying something. As for MacGraw, she and Evans broke up before filming started, and she declared she'd only make the movie if Gatsby were played by her new boyfriend, Steve McQueen. And so Ali MacGraw, who'd gotten the whole Gatsby remake ball rolling in the first place, was out because the part had already been promised to Redford. Now Evans needed a Daisy. He considered Candice Bergen and Catherine Ross. Faye Dunaway actually did a screen test. But then there was Mia Farrow, a woman who seemed destined by fate to play Gatsby's lover, for reasons that stretched back nearly 50 years. You see, it was Farrow's godfather, George Cukor, who directed the first stage production of Gatsby in 1927, and her father was the original director of the 1949 remake. Most importantly, though, of all the actresses vying for the role, Farrow was the one with the most delicate looks, the most vulnerable demeanor. From the start, the director of the 1974 Gatsby was and remained Jack Clayton, a British filmmaker who in the previous 30 years had made just 6 movies, nearly all of them adaptations of classic novels. He was meticulous and he was temperamental, but he had a sterling reputation. He had an Oscar nomination for the 1960 film Room at the Top. The chief complaint about Gatsby's direction was that its studied, stately manner, which is a hallmark of British cinema, but may have been ill-suited for a film about reckless love in 1920s New York. When the film was finally released, there was praise for the photography, the set and costume design, and critics split over the almost slavish faithfulness to Fitzgerald's prose. There were lots of complaints about the chemistry between the two stars. Most critics liked Farrow's performance, but Redford seemed distracted. He later confessed that he was obsessed at the time with the unfolding Watergate scandal. Every moment he got, he was back in his trailer or his room, watching the hearings, reading everything he could on it. Of course, years later, he turned that obsession into All the President's Men. Farrow's Daisy comes closest, I think, to capturing Fitzgerald's vision, although it's an uneven performance, and that's probably not her fault. At times, Farrow perfectly captures the shallow frivolity of Daisy, cementing the notion that Jay Gatsby's obsession with her is based on a delusion. But like all filmmakers who have taken a stab at Gatsby, Clayton and Coppola feel obliged to make the audience fall in love with Daisy just as much as Gatsby does. So when Daisy declares to Gatsby and her husband, "I love both of you," it comes off as an anguished confession, rather than the tossed-off, hurtful observation that so appalls Nick Carraway in the book. Credit Coppola with putting a red underline beneath Daisy's superficial nature in a way not even Fitzgerald did. Near the end of the book, Nick encounters Daisy's husband Tom, and he is distressed to find Tom acting as if the awful events of last summer never happened. But here, Coppola turns up the heat by having Daisy present for the encounter as well. And here is Farrow in full frivolous flower, acting for all the world as if she had not killed a woman with a car, or that the man who obsessed over her for 5 years had not been murdered as a result. On one hand, this is the Daisy we should have seen coming for the entire film. On the other, I don't know if we would have been able to stand her company for 2.5 hours. 2 footnotes regarding the 1974 Gatsby. Howard Da Silva, who was so memorable as Mr. Wilson in the 1949 version, returns here as Meyer Wolfsheim, Gatsby's shady business partner. And remember that haunting version of What'll I Do that opened the film? It's my favorite recording of this song. I have it on a playlist. It was performed by this man. No, not Bill Murray, the other guy, Bill Atherton, who went on to play Walter Peck, the fastidious EPA official in the Ghostbuster movies. And this is why, dear reader, you stick around for the closing credits of every movie. We won't dwell too much on the 2002 screen version of The Great Gatsby, which starred British actor Toby Stephens as Gatsby, and as Daisy, Myra Sorvino, who just recently won an Oscar for her role in Woody Allen's Mighty Aphrodite. It was a quickie cable TV movie filmed on a shoestring in Montreal for the A&E channel. This is the title frame from the movie. Those are Gatsby's cufflinks falling to the bottom of the swimming pool. For in this version, Gatsby is killed in the first 5 minutes, and the rest of the story is told in flashback. Very much like White Lotus, but without the palm trees. Stephens is a pretty stiff Gatsby, and Sorvino is too much of a shrinking violet to be involving. But there was one standout performance in the film, Paul Rudd as Nick Carraway. Of all the on-screen Nicks, Rudd's is the only one that seems to have walked off the pages of Fitzgerald's novel. He's a candid observer throughout, wide-eyed at the spectacle of Gatsby's lifestyle, yet always keeping himself at a distance from the empty frivolity of those around him. Rudd delivers Nick's lines with the bite of a cynic, and he manages to convey Nick's parallel sentiments of love and hatred for Gatsby. When he tells Gatsby at the end, "You're better than a lot of them," Gatsby takes it as a supreme compliment. Rudd's Nick is clearly uttering the words as a half-true act of charity. The Gatsby most familiar to moviegoers today is, of course, the 2013 version, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Gatsby, Carey Mulligan as Daisy, and Joel Edgerton as Nick. Most of all, though, the film is directed by Baz Luhrmann, whose pounding, feverish, over-the-top first half hour threatens to turn Fitzgerald's short novel into a Bollywood musical. In fact, the structure and style similarities between Luhrmann's Gatsby and his earlier Moulin Rouge are so striking, you might say in many ways it's a beat-for-beat remake. This is true right down to Luhrmann's image of the famous green light at the end of Daisy's dock, which here substitutes for the green fairy who pops up from Ewan McGregor's bottle of absinthe in Moulin Rouge. The stylistic similarities are so striking you almost expect Gatsby at his party to lean forward and whisper, "Can can." As you'd expect, Luhrmann's Gatsby does everything bigger and louder. While in every other version, Gatsby slyly ingratiates himself to Nick before almost absent-mindedly telling him who he is, here Gatsby pronounces himself, accompanied by a cascade of fireworks and a champagne toast. When Myrtle is struck by Gatsby's yellow car, she dies in a slow-motion aerial ballet that somehow launches her high above the always-watching eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Like Moulin Rouge, Gatsby quiets down considerably for the second half, and it's here that we discover that after all those false starts that preceded him in other versions of the book, DiCaprio's is by far the most nuanced Gatsby of them all. His Gatsby wears his haughty self-confidence and quivering insecurity in equal measure. The previous actors who played Gatsby, stiff Midwesterner Alan Ladd, stoic Robert Redford, all seemed almost as conscious of their established screen personas as they were of bringing Gatsby to life. DiCaprio lets the character take him wherever he wants to go, from puppy dog neediness to, in a truly terrifying scene at the Plaza Hotel, an unbridled rage that led me to believe that, in this version of the story, Gatsby might really kill a man. That year, DiCaprio was nominated for a Best Actor Oscar, but not for Gatsby, instead for The Wolf of Wall Street. It's understandable, but a regrettable oversight for having finally gotten right one of the great figures of American literature. I suppose everyone who makes a movie of The Great Gatsby figures theirs will be the definitive one. But there remains a stubborn, timeless resonance to Gatsby, be it the themes of ambition, the authenticity of the American dream, the persistence of class and society, and the lore and the appeal of the city itself. I'm reminded of the day in January 2013 when I interviewed former New York Mayor Ed Koch at his Greenwich Village apartment. He was, of course, happy to talk about himself, what politician is not, but mostly he wanted to talk about the unique, flawed, and fabulous universe that is New York City. "You really love New York, don't you?" I said finally. He smiled a soft, winsome version of that famous Ed Koch grin. "I think F. Scott Fitzgerald put it best," he told me. And then he said, "Wait, I keep the quote right here in my wallet." Ed Koch reached into his pocket and pulled out a slim black leather billfold. From it he extracted a worn fragment of paper with handwritten inscription on it, and he cleared his throat. "The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge," he began, quoting Nick Carraway, "is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and beauty of the world." The paper was gently refolded and returned to its place among the credit cards and IDs. Ed Koch smiled. "That's my city," he said. "Wild and mysterious and beautiful." I can truly say that Ed Koch's love affair with New York endured for his entire life. 2 days after we spoke, he was hospitalized. 9 days after that, he died. A few months later, the Queensboro Bridge was renamed the Edward Koch Bridge. F. Scott Fitzgerald knew a good ending when he wrote one, and that is one, I think, he would have kept.